Harry Truman had been vice president for only 82 days when the call came on April 12, 1945. A warm spring afternoon in Washington, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and blooming magnolia. And as he climbed the stairs to the private quarters of the White House, heart pounding, footsteps echoing like accusations, he already sensed what awaited him. For the taut expression of every aide, every guard, every secretary spoke of a moment too enormous to name. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who had steered America through depression and war, the man whose presence filled rooms even when he was silent, was dead in Warm Springs, and Truman, still flushed from a routine session with congressional leaders, walked into a world collapsing under the weight of history, stunned not simply by the loss but by the sudden realization of the vast, terrifying vacuum now sucking him forward. For in those few seconds between Eleanor Roosevelt's solemn gaze and her words, "Harry, the president is dead," and the oath of office delivered hastily in a cramped West Wing room still smelling faintly of ink and cigarette smoke, Truman confronted the truth that he had been vice president in name only, kept away from Roosevelt's circle, denied access to war strategy, never briefed on Yalta negotiations, never told about post-war plans, not even informed of the world-altering atomic project unfolding in secret laboratories across the country. He was, in the cruelest sense, a spare part suddenly installed to run the engine of the most powerful nation on Earth. And when the funeral preparations began, aides quietly assumed he would accompany FDR's body to Hyde Park. But Truman refused, not out of disrespect or coldness, not out of political calculation, but because he felt, in the marrow of his bones, that the mourning belonged to the nation and the Roosevelt family, not to a man who had been deliberately kept outside the president's inner sanctum, a man who had barely exchanged more than polite formalities with Roosevelt, who had never been invited into the strategy rooms where maps of Europe and the Pacific lay illuminated under dim lamps, who had never been trusted with the burden of secrets the president had guarded with near-royal exclusivity. And Truman believed that stepping into that funeral procession draped in solemnity and gravitas would be a kind of falsehood, a public intimacy he had not earned, a gesture that would ring hollow against the truth of how little he had been included. So he chose instead to remain in Washington, to stay at the White House in the hours when the nation wept, because there were decisions waiting on his desk, cables arriving from Europe where the war was cracking apart the German front, intelligence reports from the Pacific describing kamikaze waves battering American ships, and above all a folder marked only with two chilling words: the project, the first whisper of the atomic bomb he had never been told existed until that very night, the weight of which struck him harder than the news of Roosevelt's death. And in that moment Truman understood the loneliness of leadership, the crushing responsibility Roosevelt had carried in silence, and the painful distance the president had maintained even from those meant to succeed him. So while the train bearing FDR's coffin thundered northward through grieving crowds, Truman worked through the night in a dim office under a single lamp, pen scratching across documents as the radio murmured funeral hymns in the background, shoulders tight with the knowledge that he was now responsible for finishing a war he had not been invited to plan, for wielding weapons he had not been warned existed, for inheriting a world Roosevelt shaped but never shared. And as he paused occasionally to rub his eyes or stare at the portrait of Washington on the wall, he knew that not attending Roosevelt's funeral was his final acknowledgement of the distance imposed upon him, a gesture of humility to a man he barely knew yet now had to follow. And on that quiet April night, Truman faced the immense irony that he had become leader of a world he had never been prepared to inherit. The vice president kept in the dark, now forced to illuminate the path for an entire nation.
Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon.